What if the most beautiful and gifted young men in ancient China weren't admired for their talents, but bought and sold like rare treasures by the wealthy and powerful? While history often highlights the lives of female concubines, it rarely acknowledges the equally widespread, and often more heartbreaking, existence of male concubines. These were not entertainers or household servants. They were boys, often forced into intimate servitude by older, influential men who treat them like collectibles. For more than 2 millennia, across successive Chinese dynasties, this practice remained both widespread and largely unspoken. Families, desperate during times of famine or hardship, sold their sons to survive. Meanwhile, talent scouts combed rural villages, hunting for boys with the right blend of physical beauty and intellectual promise. Some were as young as 8. Once taken, they were transformed into possessions, living objects meant solely to gratify their owners. Their stories expose a hidden and disturbing chapter of Imperial Chinese culture, one where human worth was often measured by how well someone could serve the desires of the elite. In ancient texts, these boys were referred to as nan chong, male favorites, or tongling, a term for attractive young men. Unlike eunuchs or domestic servants, they filled a specific role: companions for the body and mind, molded entirely for another's pleasure. They were bought, owned, and kept for physical intimacy and companionship. The system thrived during the Han Dynasty, flourished during the Tang, and continued well into the Song and Ming eras. Historical texts like the Book of Han and Imperial court records reveal that male concubines were widely accepted across elite Chinese households, just as female concubines were. Their masters weren't only emperors and nobles. Wealthy merchants, senior bureaucrats, and even Buddhist monks kept male concubines. The practice became so normalized that families would publicly advertise their sons, and matchmakers built entire businesses around arranging such transactions. Unlike female concubines, who might earn a degree of security through childbirth or marriage, male concubines had no such prospects. Instead, they were trained to please, educated in poetry, calligraphy, music, and etiquette. In fact, their education often surpassed that of their female counterparts. Owners expected not just beauty, but also refined conversation and artistic grace. Many were fluent in classical literature, skilled musicians, and adept in philosophical discourse, but this intellectual grooming didn't lead to freedom. It only increased their market value. The practice wasn't limited to the capital. Though cities like Beijing had the highest concentrations, the trade extended to wealthy households across provinces such as Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Guangdong. In prosperous coastal centers like Guangzhou and Quanzhou, entire subcultures emerged around this hidden market. What made the system especially cruel was its moral contradiction. Confucian scholars, staunch defenders of family values, kept male concubines without hesitation. Buddhist temples, outwardly dedicated to purity, secretly housed them. This hypocrisy was blatant, but society chose to look the other way. Most of these boys were taken between the ages of 8 and 16. By their mid-20s, they were considered too old, their usefulness fading fast. Female concubines, though also victims of the system, sometimes found pathways to power or recognition. But for male concubines, there was no such future, only decline, rejection, and silence. Their lives were defined by fear, uncertainty, and a constant struggle to remain wanted. The path from innocent childhood to concubinage often began with a desperate choice, one made by families teetering on the edge of survival. During famines, floods, or total economic collapse, parents faced an unthinkable dilemma: watch their children starve, or sell them into the hands of the wealthy. Sons, heartbreakingly, were often chosen over daughters. Male concubines fetched higher prices than female servants. Into this grim reality stepped the Ren Ya, professional talent scouts, known as human teeth. They roamed through destitute villages hunting for boys who matched a precise and unforgiving set of standards. They sought flawless skin, soft facial features, bright, intelligent eyes, and a natural grace in movement. Intelligence mattered just as much as appearance. Buyers wanted companions who could discuss poetry, politics, and philosophy. The selection process was cold and dehumanizing. Boys were inspected like livestock. Their teeth checked, hands studied for elegance, voices tested for musicality. Even bone structure was scrutinized, as scouts believed they could predict a child's future beauty. Those who passed were taken immediately. Ming Dynasty writer Zhong Dai described these visits in harrowing detail. Scouts would arrive in failed harvest seasons, carrying silver coins and contracts scrawled in complex legalese, unreadable to illiterate farmers. Parents who signed rarely saw their sons again. The contracts often promised 10 to 15 years of service. Few boys survived that long. Once sold, the boys underwent a brutal transformation meant to erase their identities. Their names were replaced with poetic ones: Precious Jade, Autumn Moon. Their heads were shaved, and silk robes draped over them, not as a sign of elegance, but as a mark of ownership. Resistance was crushed through beatings, starvation, or worse. Training began immediately and was both severe and sophisticated. Boys memorized thousands of lines of classical poetry, practiced calligraphy for endless hours, and were taught to play instruments like the guqin and pipa. They learned to sing, dance, and perform in theatre, all to entertain their future masters. Some were even trained in massage, herbal healing, and basic finance, to be useful beyond beauty. But the most damaging training was psychological. Trainers broke the boys down through calculated cycles of reward and punishment. They were taught that their only worth lay in how well they could serve and please. Any display of grief, rebellion, or independence was swiftly extinguished. The aim was simple: to create elegant, talented, and completely obedient young men. The toll was immense. Mortality rates during training were staggering. Many boys succumbed to malnutrition, exhaustion, or emotional collapse. Records from the Tang dynasty suggest that barely 60% of purchased boys made it through training. The rest were buried in unmarked graves, their fates unknown even to the families who had sold them. For those who survived, daily life as a male concubine was a ritual of controlled submission. They woke before dawn, preparing for their master's gaze, grooming, applying makeup, choosing the perfect robe. Unlike servants with defined duties, these young men lived in constant alertness, expected to fulfill every desire, spoken or unspoken. Their quarters reflected their strange, in-between status. More lavish than servants' quarters, but far beneath the rooms of wives, their chambers were ornate yet oppressive. Silk curtains, jade ornaments, and lacquered furniture hid a darker truth. Doors locked from the outside, windows barred, movements constantly watched. For all the beauty around them, they were prisoners dressed in luxury. Life inside the household was not just controlled, it was a battleground. Rivalry among male concubines was brutal, often deadly. Masters encouraged the competition, promising rewards to the most entertaining and punishing those who disappointed. This constant manipulation created a toxic environment where trust was dangerous and friendship nearly impossible. The hierarchy was cruel by design. Older concubines, hardened by years of survival, often ruled over newcomers with harsh authority. Having learned that compassion equaled weakness, and weakness meant removal, they became enforcers of the system. New arrivals were subjected to ritual hazing, food deprivation, public humiliation, even beatings, all sanctioned by the household's unofficial pecking order. Their daily routines were dictated entirely by their master's preferences. Mornings might be filled with poetry readings, calligraphy practice, or rehearsals for musical performances. Afternoons could mean massage duties, private conversations, or being paraded at social events to entertain guests like trained performers. The psychological toll was immense. Many concubines developed what we would now call anxiety, depression, or PTSD. They became experts in reading their master's moods, altering their tone, posture, or expression in seconds to avoid punishment. Some learned to manipulate, using charm and wit to earn small favors or delay cruelty. Survival depended on it. Even meals became instruments of control. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was a reflection of favor. A concubine in good standing might dine on roasted meats, fruits, and fine wine. Others, less favored, would survive on plain rice and watery soup. Physical appearance had to be carefully maintained. Weight gain or visible aging could mean losing everything. Their relationships with the women of the household, wives and female concubines, were complex and often fraught. At times, they shared information or emotional support in rare moments of alliance against a cruel master. More often, they were rivals, competing for attention and resources. Some women resented the male concubines, who often received better education, finer clothing, and more of the master's time. Medical care was scarce and unreliable. Illness rendered a concubine temporarily useless, and many masters had no patience for weakness. Traditional medicine could do little for serious conditions, and untreated injuries, often from punishment, were hidden to avoid being labeled damaged or defective. Yet, even in this environment of cruelty, rare moments of genuine connection occurred. Some concubines, having endured together for years, formed deep bonds of friendship. Secret lifelines in an otherwise isolated world. They shared food, whispered support, and occasionally dared to dream of escape. Few such plans ever succeeded, but hope itself became a quiet act of resistance. At the very top of this twisted hierarchy stood the Imperial court, a place where a concubine could either rise to unimaginable heights or fall into disgrace. The most famous story of male concubinage in Chinese history came during the reign of Emperor Ai of the Han Dynasty, whose relationship with a young man named Dong Xian left a lasting mark on literature and culture. Dong Xian entered the court at age 17, the son of a minor official. His ethereal beauty immediately caught the emperor's eye during a formal ceremony. According to the Book of Han, Dong Xian had skin like polished jade and eyes that sparkled like stars. Within weeks, he was transformed from a low-ranking courtier into the emperor's closest companion and beloved favorite. Emperor Ai's obsession was boundless. He showered Dong Xian with honors, gifts, estates, fortunes worth millions in today's terms. Their most famous moment became a symbol of love across Chinese literature. One morning, the emperor awoke to find Dong Xian asleep on his sleeve. Rather than disturb him, the emperor cut off the sleeve entirely, choosing love over formality. From that moment on, the cut sleeve became a metaphor for male love in China. The emperor's devotion went further. He appointed Dong Xian to high office despite his youth and inexperience, and elevated his entire family to positions of power. It was a rare instance where a concubine story ended in influence rather than erasure, but it was also a dangerous exception, not the rule. Dong Xian's influence grew so powerful that high-ranking officials began addressing him directly, bypassing the emperor altogether. For a while, this arrangement worked, until Emperor Ai died suddenly at the age of 26. In an instant, Dong Xian's world unraveled. The new emperor, under pressure from rivals who had long resented Dong Xian's prominence, stripped him of all titles and ordered his execution. Rather than face torture and public disgrace, Dong Xian took his own life, ending one of the most famous same-sex relationships in Chinese imperial history. His story became a tragic warning. Male concubines could rise to dizzying heights, but their falls were often swift and brutal. Later emperors, like Emperor Zhengde of the Ming dynasty, took male favoritism even further. Instead of a single beloved companion, he amassed dozens of young men from across the empire, housing them in a palace wing known as the Lacquered Quarter. These weren't just concubines. They were hunting partners, drinking companions, and fixtures at his extravagant parties that scandalized the court. Zhengde's favorites wielded real political power. They influenced decisions about military posts, tax reforms, even foreign policy. The emperor trusted them more than his trained ministers, often with disastrous consequences. Some historical records claim that wars were started simply because favorites convinced the emperor they would be fun or glorious. In response to such chaos, the Qing dynasty attempted to crack down. Strict moral codes were passed, punishing officials found keeping male concubines. But even Qing emperors secretly continued the tradition, just with greater discretion. Emperor Kangxi, for example, had several documented male companions, though court records carefully avoided any explicit mention of their intimacy. Life at court was far more dangerous than in private households. Imperial favorites attracted deadly jealousy. They were framed for treason, poisoned by rivals, or executed on fabricated charges. The higher they climbed, the more enemies they made. And unlike some wealthy merchants who may have cared for their concubines, emperors treated them as refined playthings, discarded the moment a newer, younger face arrived. The imperial court became a revolving door of tributes. Governors sent beautiful boys to curry favor, knowing the politics behind such gifts. These young men weren't just ornaments. They shaped policies, fueled rivalries, and at times destabilized entire governments. The decline of the Tang dynasty was partially blamed on Emperor Xuanzong, who, distracted by his male and female favorites, allowed the empire to fall into neglect and rebellion. Violent ends were common. Imperial records list numerous concubines who died by suicide, execution, or mysterious illness. Their bodies were often buried outside palace grounds, their names erased from history. In life they were celebrated. In death, they vanished. The existence of male concubines revealed a jarring contradiction at the heart of Chinese society. Publicly, Confucianism preached morality, filial piety, and strict gender roles. Privately, even the scholars who championed these values maintained male concubines without hesitation. Regional attitudes varied. In northern cities like Beijing, the practice was more openly tolerated among elites. In the southern provinces, Guangdong, Fujian, it was more discreet, but just as widespread. Merchants in coastal cities like Guangzhou maintained vast underground networks for the trade, even as they publicly upheld traditional values. Poetry and art played a major role in masking the system's cruelty. Renowned poets like Li Bai and Du Fu romanticized male companionship in beautiful, veiled language. Their verses, while never explicit, helped normalize these relationships under the guise of artistic admiration. For many families, economic survival drove the entire machine. Selling a son could fund a daughter's marriage or secure food for an entire household. They convinced themselves that one child's suffering could save the rest. A cruel but calculated sacrifice. This created a system where children were commodities. Their value was assessed, sold, and consumed. Temples added another layer of contradiction. Buddhist and Taoist monasteries preached detachment, but secretly housed male concubines for wealthy patrons. Some monks kept favorites of their own, cloaking their actions in spiritual justifications about mentorship or purification. Class lines were rigid. Poor families sold their sons. Rich families never would. This created a parasitic system where the elite quite literally thrived on the desperation of the lower classes, turning poverty into an endless resource for their pleasure. Even Confucian scholars crafted elaborate defenses. They claimed male concubines offered intellectual companionship that wives, often uneducated, could not. Some argued that these relationships were purer than marriage, free from inheritance or pregnancy complications. The government's stance was riddled with hypocrisy. Laws against male concubinage technically existed, but enforcement was selective and corrupt. Often, these laws were used not to protect victims but to eliminate political rivals. Officials calling for reform in public often kept their own private stables of boys. In the end, the destruction inflicted on these young men, emotional, physical, psychological, was deliberate and systematic. Their beauty was admired, their talent consumed, their humanity erased. Unlike female concubines, who might eventually gain some autonomy through motherhood or widowhood, male concubines faced a steady decline from the moment they entered their master's household. Their worth was tied entirely to their youth and physical beauty, a value that faded quickly and cruelly. By their early 20s, many showed signs of premature aging brought on by stress, poor nutrition, and the relentless pressure to appear perfect. Hours were spent daily applying cosmetics, sculpting hair, and enduring painful beauty treatments that often harmed their skin and health. For many, substance abuse became the only escape. Opium, common in wealthy households, offered temporary relief from constant psychological trauma. Addiction followed swiftly. Some concubines became dependent within months, sliding deeper into vulnerability and manipulation. The suicide rate was staggeringly high. Exact numbers are hard to determine. Deaths were often hidden or attributed to illness to avoid scandal. Ming Dynasty records mention young men leaping from rooftops, drowning themselves in ornamental ponds, or hanging in locked chambers. Their deaths, quietly rebranded as accidents, with a final erasure of lives already invisible. Violence was normalized. A kind master might beat his concubines only occasionally. Others inflicted daily harm, for discipline, amusement, or no reason at all. Isolated in private quarters, their screams went ignored by staff too afraid to intervene. Medical treatment offered little comfort. Traditional Chinese medicine of the time had no remedies for trauma, and treatments for injuries were often crude or dangerous. Broken bones were set poorly. Internal injuries went untreated. Many concubines lived and died with permanent disabilities. Worse than the physical abuse was the psychological reprogramming. From a young age, these boys were taught they had no value beyond their ability to please. Networks did form among them. Underground lines of support where concubines exchanged survival tips, warned each other about cruel masters, and shared hope in hushed tones. A few managed to escape this fate. Some, once discarded by aging masters or freed by death, reinvented themselves as scholars, artists, or traders. But success required extraordinary talent, relentless will, and access to resources that most never had. These rare stories became legends. Tales passed among the desperate as flickers of impossible hope. The decline of the male concubine system began in the late Qing dynasty. As Western influence grew, Chinese society came under scrutiny. Christian missionaries, horrified by what they encountered, reported the practice widely, drawing international attention and condemnation. With the fall of the imperial system in the 1911 Republican Revolution, much of the aristocratic culture that had sustained male concubinage collapsed. The new Republic of China banned concubinage altogether, male and female alike. But the ban was inconsistently enforced, and in remote regions, the practice lingered for decades. The fate of the last generation of male concubines remains largely unknown. Many were abandoned by their masters who now feared legal consequences. Without marketable skills or social standing, some died of starvation or illness. Others simply disappeared. Absorbed into the vast, indifferent population, their stories buried with them. After the communist victory in 1949, the government launched aggressive campaigns to stamp out so-called feudal practices. Former concubines were interrogated, forced to name their masters and recount their pasts. Some were executed as relics of a corrupt era. Others were sent to labor camps for ideological re-education. Today, modern China has nearly erased this history. It remains a taboo subject, conflicting with the official narrative of traditional moral purity. Scholars face immense difficulty studying it. Many documents have been destroyed, censored, or hidden from view. But the forgotten stories of male concubines expose a universal truth: that exploitation, once normalized, can become invisible. These young men were not simply victims of one culture's excesses. They represent how any society can justify horror when it benefits the powerful. Their legacy speaks to us still. Human trafficking, child labor, modern-day servitude all persist behind social norms, economic necessity, or legal loopholes. These boys, whose names were lost and whose lives were stolen, should not be remembered as exotic footnotes, but as human beings brutalized by a system that turned suffering into tradition. Their stories are warnings. Progress is not guaranteed. Societies can slip backwards when injustice is ignored. Above all, their lives remind us that human dignity is not negotiable, no matter the century, the culture, or the excuse.